Welcome to the CSAE Research Podcasts, a series of conversations about projects taking place linked to the Center of the Study of African Economies at the University of Oxford. I'm Noam Angrist, a senior fellow at the University of Oxford and a co-founder of Youth Impact, which is one of the largest NGOs in Botswana. Youth Impact was founded in 2014 to scale up evidence in health and education around the world and is headquartered in Botswana, now working in over 10 countries and counting with partners. So today I'm really excited to discuss a groundbreaking new study we've been involved in, titled Building Resilient Education Systems, Evidence from Large-Scale Randomized Trials in 5 Countries. The project focuses on an approach called Connected, and this is really a phone call tutorial program to deliver high-quality education through a mobile phone call. Originally, this approach was tested in Botswana in the early part of the pandemic, and since then, the results came out very early and were quite positive, published in Nature Human Behavior. And then there was demand to replicate this approach all over the world. And we partnered with governments, multilaterals like the World Bank, NGOs, research organizations like JPAL and IPA to do just that, and ended up replicating this approach in 5 additional randomized trials around the world. So today I'm really excited to introduce research and implementation partners behind this paper and study to give a behind-the-scenes look into how it happened and where it's going. The 5 countries were India, Nepal, Kenya, Philippines, and Uganda. So really historic multi-country replication effort. Results were just released in the NBER, so very excited to dive in today. Joining me today, we have a fantastic set of folks. So first, I'm thrilled to introduce, and I'm going to go through and ask everyone questions, Thato Letsomo, who's a senior manager of content and training at Youth Impact in Botswana. Will tell us a little bit about the origin story. Cullen, a postdoctoral fellow in development economics at the CSAE at the University of Oxford, and a research specialist at Youth Impact. Karisha Cruz, who is a senior policy and project development associate at IPA Philippines. Ainomugisha at Building Tomorrow, the learning coordinator. And Pramod, Bathena, co-founder and director of an NGO called Alokit in India. In addition to Karisha, Michael, and Sai's organizations around the world in Philippines, Uganda, and India, we also partnered with New Globe in Kenya, and in Nepal with the World Bank, with the government, and 2 NGOs, Teach for Nepal and Street Child. So a really diverse coalition, 5 randomized trials, 18 months. And providing real-time evidence on really critical issues of how to provide high-quality remote instruction when schools were disrupted. Some of the largest, fastest evidence generated in education. One of the questions was, would this approach scale across countries with different types of partners? So I'm thrilled to dive in today and take us back to that original study in Botswana. So Thato, you were there at the beginning. Can you tell us a little bit about the origin story? How and when did this program start? What does it involve? And what do you think is core to it and needed to stay as it was adapted across settings? And what could be adapted? So take it away, Thato.
Thank you so much, Noam. I'm excited to be speaking here in this podcast alongside some of those who see this program and replicated it in their context across the globe. As Noam has introduced, my name is Thato, and this program started in 2020 when COVID hit the globe. And we collected phone numbers and the schools that we were working with, and we reached out to those households over the phone. And it didn't need high-tech phones, just a simple phone. And we were sending SMSs or with basic maths problems, and would follow up with a 20 minutes call every week. And then there's phone calls. Children or learners were tutored or taught basic maths. one of the things that we thought of as we were creating or doing this program was to make sure that we keep it very simple as much as possible. And the other thing that we had to really think of was to make sure that it's basic mobile phones, just the low tech. Then the last thing that we're also thinking of was making sure that the content is very targeted to the ability of the child. And this is one of the things as we were talking to countries that wanted to replicate or take the program up, was one of the messages that we were saying to say the principle is keeping it simple and making sure that the content is targeted.
Thank you, Thato. Amazing in its simplicity and kind of how much of the innovation was actually in keeping it so simple and accessible and cheap. So the phone is obviously a key feature of this. You mentioned targeting. Would you say that was, if you had to pick a principle that was really core to the pedagogy, would you say that's what it was? And can you describe that a little bit more?
Thank you so much, Noam. That was the main principle and very core to the program. Like we have already mentioned, the core principle was making sure that the instructions are targeted. And what does that mean? It's that one of the things that we're doing is to check the level of the child. And if the child knows addition only, we'll start them at subtraction, not teaching the child everything. So we should make sure that the instructions are the simple and are very targeted to the level of the child. Then one of the things that we're doing in this call, every week in the call, we'll give a problem for the day to check if the child has learned something during this 20 minutes phone call, and make sure that in the following week when you are calling, you are targeting the instructions to the level that the child would be at.
Got it. And very interesting that you're using these high frequency kind of mini assessments to target that instruction. And as we know, that is an approach that's been tested in school settings before through program models like Teaching at the Right Level, and was adapted to this COVID and phone-based context. And it also is interesting because this call is one-on-one, might also help target it even further. You can really address the child's needs almost like tutoring. So targeting really key, and great to hear that come through, that it's not just the platform of the phone, but also the pedagogy of targeting. So Claire, I'm going to shift over to you. Can you tell us how we designed these multi-country studies to try to answer some of the key scaling questions? Would this work outside of Botswana? How would it need to be effective across these settings?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's two aspects to that. So obviously there's the exciting, promising results from the Botswana first proof of concept, but then we wanted to see if it worked in multiple other contexts. So one aspect of scaling is, does it work when it's delivered to more students in different kinds of places? And so part of that is this like massive 5-country randomized controlled trial effort. And then another dimension is we wanted to see if it works depending on who implements it. So is the program robust and effective no matter who's implementing? So we randomized students to receive the program from either government or NGO implementers in some context. So that helps us answer the question, like potentially could it be scaled by government teachers?
Fascinating. And we do know that the proof of concept studies from other evidence often do not scale to other settings, so really critical. And we also know that there's been studies where NGOs can deliver something effectively, and when the exact same thing is delivered by government, it might not replicate. So really critical that this was in the design. Fascinating. What were the results?
Yeah, super exciting to share, and very happy that the results are now out. So we found that the phone and SMS tutoring program caused really large improvements in learning. So a 0.32 standard deviation improvement in learning outcomes, which is huge. It's also very cheap. It was really cost effective. And so just to give it like a benchmark, when we looked at a review of education programs out there, we found that this is amongst the most cost effective programs out there. So that's really promising. Should also mention that it was effective everywhere. So in all 5 countries, there was a statistically significant improvement in learning. Obviously, there are differences across programs, but it worked. And then also really excitingly, we found that it was equally effective no matter who delivered it, whether it was government, teachers, or NGO implementers.
Very striking. And so usually we know that things don't replicate. So the fact that this is replicating and replicating so well, and in some ways better than the original Botswana study, fascinating. And maybe it is because it's building on these well-known principles like targeting instruction and tutoring, which are these really effective approaches, and just adapting it to this phone-based setting. So fascinating to see this approach work. Can you share a bit, Claire, on how we thought from a measurement point of view and a research point of view around monitoring and measuring what's common, what's adapted, how to really have some fidelity to the core model, but still give room to make sure this fits in local settings?
Yeah, that's such an important balance to strike. So you obviously need to adapt things a bit in a new context. So for example, we found that place value is taught a little bit differently in Nepal. And so there's latitude with the curriculum to change how that's explained a little bit. But broadly, like the curriculum, the training, so Thato running the training of trainers in different countries was the same, the tools are the same, and the principles that you and Thato have talked about. So the like tutoring aspect and the targeting, they were the same, while there's like little bits of differences in flexibility. But the way to make sure that our partners made sure that it was effective and to track implementation fidelity in all contexts was the same. So we measured what it was that Thato was talking about, like was the program accurately targeted? So were teachers teaching students the level that they should have been teaching them? And we found we have a paper coming out in the AEA Papers and Proceedings, and that shows really cool results that, unlike this story out there that you mentioned, Noam, that like maybe nothing scales and everything works well in the first proof of concept when everyone's attention is on it. But then when you go to scale, like things diminish. And so we actually find that implementation fidelity gets better and better trial by trial, and also week by week within trials. So that's a super exciting story. And it kind of taught us that collecting high frequency monitoring data is super, super key and very informative and also exciting.
Fascinating, and such an important balance to strike of measuring that thing we know is key, and then giving room, but then also actually, what you're sharing is we even saw that the level of targeting can improve if you monitor it and you learn from experience. You can get better and better at it. I think this feature of getting better and better and learning from experience does really seem to be key to this scaling journey across settings. And rather than just kind of totally hand it off, there's some mechanism to coordinate across partners and settings. And as we mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, it really was a diverse array of partners. And it was happening in countries Youth Impact had not worked in before, with quite large organizations like governments and the World Bank. But that coordination across partners and ability to share lessons, really important and fascinating to see that show up in the data. So now I'm actually going to turn to the partners and hear from their perspective in various country contexts. So I'm going to start with CSAE in India, with Alokit, right, an NGO that was working with government teachers to deliver this. CSAE, can you share what initially drew you to this program, and what did it look like in your context?
Right. So we implemented this program in government residential schools in the Telangana state of India. The government here runs residential schools for children from the most marginalized scheduled caste and scheduled tribe communities, whose family incomes are less than $1,250 annually. In this network, despite the best efforts from the government, only about 20% of the children were engaged in learning or consuming learning materials shared through WhatsApp, TV, or Zoom sessions. An additional challenge was that the students lived far away from the school, sometimes almost 70 to 100 kilometers, and teachers were finding it very difficult to kind of reach the students. And we were looking at ways to educate the children and reduce the learning loss. The department was also looking for partners. So that's when we were drawn towards Connected program, and we realized that already the Connected program was tested, evidence was coming up already. So that's how we were drawn into this program. We thought we should definitely implement it and pilot here.
That's great. Great to hear that. And obviously there were so many things to pick from, right? It was this moment of uncertainty, of need. And so great to hear what drew you to this approach. Moving to Uganda, Michael, from your perspective as Building Tomorrow, what drew you to the program? And also what it looked like in your setting. And as we know, in Uganda, there were some of the longest school closures in the world.
Thank you, Dr. Noam Angrist. Like you did last say there, Uganda was not exceptional to the rest of the other countries under COVID lockdowns. Uganda actually faced about 2 years of school closures, which left about 15 million learners affected. And prior to these school closures, only about 4% of the learners could do basic math operations by grade 4, a situation that was further exacerbated by COVID-19. Our organization has contributed to stemming learning loss by using a corps of about 7,000 community educational volunteers to deliver literacy and numeracy lessons to all learners using the Teach at the Right Level methodology and our signature name Roots to Rise program. And by 2022, we were able to reach about 100,000 learners. Think about it, for example, a case in point, a one Aisha who was under our programs, always a top performer in her class and an academic inspiration to her peers. And after about 2 years of schools reopening, she was struggling to recorrect her concepts taught in class and found it a little bit disturbing for her. This meant that the teachers had to do so much to get Aisha up to speed with schoolwork. And this was not unique to Aisha alone, but also across about 15 million learners. Working with Connect Ed program to stem learning loss, using our community educational volunteers and proving their efficacy was important for us. See a way how we can scale this approach and stem the crisis.
Got it. Very important and great to see this model of community education volunteers being able to deliver this in their local settings, even through the phone, and in a setting where schools closed for so long. We also know in the Philippines, there were some of the longest school closures in the world. And of course, in all settings, schools were disrupted for far too long. So we're going to shift over to the Philippines. Isha, what drew you to the program? IPA also, many priorities, many different sectors, lots going on, lots of uncertainty. Why this program and what did it look like in your setting?
Right. So in the Philippines at that time, schools remained physically closed due to the pandemic. And while there was remote learning, there was no regular teacher-student interaction for almost 2 years. So most kids learned through what we call self-learning modules, which really had limited student-teacher interaction. And that was a big concern among our teachers. Even prior to the pandemic, we're seeing poor learning outcomes, especially on numeracy and literacy among our young learners. So there was really a need to find effective strategies to improve learning and also to stem learning loss that time. And it was great timing when Youth Impact approached IPA and shared the great work that they've done in Botswana. And we thought this could be a feasible program because in the Philippines, mobile phones are very accessible both for teachers and households. And so we met with DepEd to share this new evidence on learning via phone tutoring and ask whether we can test this program to see whether this low-cost intervention could actually work in our context and potentially address these learning challenges and support learning recovery. And so we were able to engage with DepEd across all governance levels, from the central office down to the field offices and schools, and we got their support. And we tested actually 2 models for grades 3 and 4 learners, the teacher aid arm or the NGO arm where IPA hired teacher aides to deliver the phone tutoring, and the DepEd teacher arm or the government arm where the DepEd teachers themselves were able to deliver the phone-based tutoring program.
And I remember IPA, Philippines, and DepEd, this was one of the partnerships where we did have that. We had that randomization between government and NGO. We also had that in Nepal. And so that's really fascinating and proved very important to understand, can this be delivered by governments? So now shifting gears towards this question again of common things that work versus things that you need to adapt. So would love to hear from everyone again. What did you keep the same and you felt like was relevant and important to keep the same? And what did you adapt to your setting? So Sai, over to you in India.
Yeah, we did keep the similar structure in terms of sending SMS every week and doing phone calls to the students once in a week. That kind of remained the same in India as well, just like in Botswana. However, two big things that we made change was in terms of involving the school heads. This is the first time teachers are also getting used to a program like this, so we thought it will be helpful if school heads are also involved in it, so that they know how to support teachers well in the implementation of the program. So the school heads were also part of the training, and school heads were also given updates constantly every week, so that they know how many teachers are able to complete calls and if there is any need to support with additional teachers. Right, that's something different that we did. And the second difference that we did was in terms of data collection process. In Botswana, I think survey CT was used as a collection mechanism. However, in India, teachers are not very much aware of survey CTO. So we leveraged Google Forms, which teachers were more familiar here. So these are the two big changes that we made.
That's great. And I know that Alokit also has this focus on school leadership. So really interesting to see that engagement throughout multiple levels of the education system. Michael, what about you? What did you keep similar and what did you adapt?
Thank you, Doctor. In our context, we didn't really deviate much again from the Botswana trial. We kept the SMS and phone arm and the control arm and delivering weekly phone calls, basically do targeted instruction numeracy lessons, but also weekly SMSs. However, in our context, we used heavily our community educational volunteers who were already familiar with delivering literacy and numeracy lessons. And with Connected program and the trainings we did get and give to the community educational volunteers only improved their delivery mechanism via phone calls. And we also did have in there translation of material content that was delivered by our community educational volunteers, but also the tools that were capturing the assessments and the data so that it is of quality. And to tie it in there, we also did have a strong monitoring system where we were supported by our Building Tomorrow Fellows, who are young graduates recruited from our university, deployed to recruit these community educational volunteers, but also on a weekly basis, engage them to get the challenges and any successes they have, registered, and give them support so that quality delivery of these lessons was the most important thing for this program.
And I recall in Uganda, we actually used these paper-based tools because it was decentralized. So that was quite an impressive operation to be able to do that. Whereas in other settings, we did have to use, and we chose to use, digital tools. So that was really fascinating and worked quite well. Isha, over to you in the Philippines. What did you keep similar and what did you adapt?
So in the Philippines, we used the same set of interventions. So we adopted the SMS and phone call intervention. So what we did, though, is to contextualize these materials. So we worked with Youth Impact and DepEd to align with the competencies targeted to our grade 3 and grade 4 learners. And we tried to localize the math exercises as well and translated them to the local languages for our learners. And similar to what the others have mentioned, we've also implemented electronic data collection where teachers or the teacher aides were able to use their mobile phones to look at the forms, the phone call scripts, and also to submit the data that they collect every week. So that enabled us to do real-time monitoring.
And I remember this language issue was such a big one. It was in many settings. In many countries, there were lots of languages. Botswana only has a few, but in, Philippines and Uganda and India, there were more languages. So I remember this question coming up on how to match the caller to the student in terms of common language, which we know is an issue even before COVID, certainly after. And it was interesting to see the phone be this flexible tool to actually facilitate that match in a very nimble fashion. You could really make sure that you had the right caller and student speaking together in that same common language. So fascinating. So I think we're hearing across all three countries, keeping a very similar model, this phone call combined with SMS messages really working, and some of these adaptations on monitoring, on language, on tutor and delivery agent. One thing I will say that we did see, the story sounds positive with these positive effects of phone calls and SMSs across all settings. But the story is not all rosy. I remember we saw that the SMS messages on their own were not enough. So we had a treatment arm in these studies that was only SMS messages, and that only worked in 2 countries, not all 5, and the effects were smaller. So one of the things we learned from this is that it did have to be a phone call accompanying that SMS. It couldn't just be SMS. And that was really important because SMS is particularly cheap and particularly scalable, but it just wasn't enough to deliver that impact in these settings. Whereas phone calls were effective and still cheap and scalable. And I remember that lesson being really important in thinking about which types of these models do we really want to take to scale. So on that note, I want to ask each partner, what is next? What are you taking forward in your organization? What are you scaling? How are you scaling? Would love to hear from you on what is next. So again, starting with you, Sai, in India, what have you learned? What are you taking forward and what's next for you?
So what really worked well and something that we are taking forward is the principle of targeting. So post-COVID, as kids returned to schools, we noticed that children were having a lot of learning gap because in India, more or less 2 years of school closures were there. So we picked up this principle of targeting that we learned from the Connected program, and we adapted that into most of our programs. So we are training our school heads on how to apply this principle of targeting so that they can also train their teachers. So most of the school heads have now adapted this principle to teach language and also remediate in both mother tongue as both English and Telugu as well as mathematics. So that's something which is really working well for us.
That's great. And I think this point on targeting has really come out over and over again. I should also reference, there's been other work on this approach and this topic. And there was a study in Sierra Leone that did phone calls but did not target instruction. And there it wasn't effective. So this piece on targeting is really key. And we even did see that in the original Botswana study. We cross-randomized targeted instruction and those effects were more positive. So that's great to hear, Sai, that that's a principle that you're really taking forward. Michael, what are you taking forward? What is Building Tomorrow doing next? And how are you thinking about scaling some of these lessons up?
Well, for Building Tomorrow, one thing really this program has helped us learn is it has helped us to validate the effectiveness of phone-based learning and actually empowered us to scale our EWACA program, more so of a delivery automated platform to deliver numeracy lessons through interactive voice recognition, VA2G fonts, and also helped us to validate that community educational volunteers can equally be effective instructors, and we continue to elevate them in our model so that we can reach as many learners as possible, and doing an A/B testing to look at very many other factors to see why in our context was this successful for this particular program is important for us as we influence policy implications in our country to ensure literacy and numeracy for all.
That's great. And this point on the tutor really can be volunteers, it can be teachers. We're seeing that across these models, this approach can be effective. So great to hear about those plans going forward. In the Philippines, Isha, I know there's been a lot of exciting momentum with the Department of Education. Can you tell us what's next, especially in light of the fact that we explicitly tested a government model in the Philippines and saw that it could work?
That's right. Yeah, so we're still having talks with DepEd officials to explore ways on how to optimize the delivery of this phone-based tutoring, mainly to support learner recovery or remedial education that can be aligned with our plans for national remedial or tutoring programs. And we find a lot of opportunities to continue education even post-COVID school closures. And actually, just recently, we completed a workshop with DepEd Central Office just to think about ways on how we can approach this. And one of the things that we are looking at is running this program in emergency settings, such as climate-related emergencies. So as you know, in the Philippines, we're a very highly disaster-prone country, and that has led to several school disruptions in the past years. And so we're actually able to test this program during a disaster, and we found that it was actually effective. So when the typhoon hit, I think it was around December 2021. We were already about a few weeks into the phone-based tutoring program. And so while there were some disruptions because of damages due to the typhoon, we found that the phone call tutorial was effective and it still improved learning of our learners. So yeah, so and to further optimize for scale, we do plan to conduct more tests with the government and potentially other education partners interested in running this low-cost phone-based learning program. So a lot of potential, and we are excited to continue this conversation.
And that typhoon was such a shock. And I remember it was such an incredible effort that IPA and DepEd, you collaborated on to keep learning going. And I think that really does show the ability of this approach to provide resilience in education systems to withstand multiple shocks. And this really has opened our eyes to this broader issue of school disruption. Obviously, it was historic during COVID in scale. But it happens in other settings. As you said, Isha, it happens weather shocks, rainy seasons, typhoons, monsoons. There's other types of disruptions in conflict settings. I know there's a semi-autonomous region in the Philippines that has some conflict disruptions, as well as this happening in many countries around the world. One estimate, Education Cannot Wait, estimates that 222 million children are currently experiencing disrupted schooling due to some kind of education and emergency. So having this evidence on a way to build resilience into education systems so they can withstand these shocks, so key. And these two parallel tracks in the Philippines you're pursuing on ed and emergencies, as well as what does this look like during normal times with the government, really exciting. And I know there's been lots of momentum with undersecretaries and directors, alignment with policy in making this happen. So very, very exciting to hear from folks who were on the front lines and really made this happen. Thank you so much, Michael, Isha, and Sai. I'm going to bring us back to Botswana. Thato, what kept happening in Botswana as this approach spread around the world? Did you stop? Did you keep going? What were you doing in Botswana while this was radiating to multiple countries?
Thank you so much, Noam. And I think it's exciting also sitting here and listening into what other countries have done and how they're thinking of this going forward. It's so humbling and exciting to see how much a lot of learners across the country had benefited out of this program. And in Botswana, we have never stopped because the demand is still very high. There are a lot of parents who are calling and saying, why is my child not part of this program? There are children or students who are bragging to other learners when they get back to school, saying that I have someone who's calling me over the phone and they have taught me how to do division that I have been struggling with. And these are some of the stories that we get from the field that make us to keep going and pressing on, because in general, our learners most of our learners are still lagging behind in basic numeracy. So one of the things that also we have done and we are still doing is running rapid innovations every school term on A/B testing. And one of the A/B testing has also even tripled some of those effects. So it's exciting to see what this program has done. And it's exciting to see the demand right from the Ministry of Education, from the household, from the parents, and even some of the teachers. There was a time one teacher called when the schools reopened and said, I hear in my class, I have not yet introduced division. And when I introduced it, one child just raised up their hand and said she knows how to do division. And I asked them to come to the board and show how they do the division. And the child did it so well. And the way that even me as a teacher, I was not going to be able to explain to the learners. And when she asked this child, the student said, someone called them over the phone from Youth Impact, and they taught them this concept during over the phone. And the teacher called to really appreciate and say she has started using this child as more like as a co-teacher or facilitator to teach other students. So those are some of the things that shows us that the program is still working. And like I have said, the demand is still very high.
It's so great to hear, Thato, that this kept going and that you kept learning. I think this is one of the striking things. On the one hand, this approach and this evidence base become one of the largest multi-country evidence bases in education, 6 RCTs and counting that we've been directly involved in. Other authors and organizations are also testing this approach. The Inter-American Development Bank has now tested this approach in 4 countries, the Center for Global Development, and others. And it's exciting. On the one hand, there is so much evidence. On the other hand, there's so much more to learn. We're just scratching the surface on what this type of approach can do, where it can work, where it won't work, and how to scale it up. So it's just so great to hear that this has kept going and continued to improve in Botswana simultaneously. So I just want to thank all of the folks who've joined us on this podcast. It's always so wonderful to hear from people directly who make these studies happen. We often see the paper, we see the results. There's a lot there, and there's so much more behind the paper. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Thato. Thank you, Claire, Michael, Isha, Sai, and it's just a treat to have collaborated with you and to hear your perspective on this, and looking forward to seeing where this effort can go. So thank you, everyone, and looking forward to being in touch.
Thank you so much, Noam, and thank you everyone for listening in.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.